SEP Fanfic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Days 22. Chapter 6. There is no crown. April 10th, 2011. Percy Weasley did not do social calls. At least, social calls without a purpose. That would be a waste of his time, and he had never been the sort to do such a thing. They were close in the sense that they had been friends for years, through Ron, obviously, but outside of that too. Percy managed her legal issues, documentation, concerns, and questions. He also kept her abreast of what was happening in the ministry and beyond, but nothing else. Percy was careful about that, just in case anyone had questions for her. So, when Percy stepped out of her flue after 9, while she was kneading dough for bread, Hermione regarded him with a puzzled expression that cooled to something wary when she noticed his casual attire. "Are you all right?" she asked with a slight tilt of her head. "Everything okay with Arthur and Molly?" "Yes, of course." Percy was wearing gray trousers and a plaid shirt, but he might as well have been wearing pajamas. Very strange. It all got weirder when Percy washed and dried his hands before approaching her from the left, ready to help. Hermione arched an eyebrow. "Do you even know how to bake bread?" "No, but I make an excellent banoffee pie." "Good enough." He took over kneading the dough while Hermione prepared the bread maker, a gift to herself after several disastrous attempts. Percy worked quietly, his mind elsewhere. The pan was ready before he finished, and she had to bump his shoulder to get his attention. Embarrassment tinted his features, turning his ears red in a way that reminded her so much of Ron that it made her snort. He stepped to the side and allowed her to finish up, and by the time she washed her hands of the flour, his were cleaned and he was sitting at the island. It was too early in the baking process for them to smell the product of their efforts, but soon. Hermione loved the smell of baking bread. It smelled like home. She finished drying her hands with her back still to him. "I know this isn't a social call." Then she looked over her shoulder at the redhead, whose pensiveness had returned amid the silence. "It's not." Percy had never been anything except direct. "More than one thing?" "Of course." Hermione joined him at the island, but only after grabbing a schiava from the chiller and summoning 2 glasses. He poured while she sat down, and they both swirled their glasses before drinking quietly. It was good. Sweet like berries and cotton candy. She'd picked it because, while Percy would claim to prefer Merlot or Chianti, Hermione knew he had a penchant for the sweeter, dry wine that was light and elegant. "Where do you want to start?" Hermione turned on her stool to face him. "Business might be easier. How's your pet project?" She gave Percy a meaningful look, knowing little about it beyond its existence. Technical ignorance. "Slowly, but coming together." His answer was flippant. "I'm trying to arrange a visit to a Cambridge library with a secret, private wizarding section. It happens to have access that I've been trying to obtain for the last 4 years. Hermione's eyebrows lifted in silent curiosity at the very mention of a secret library. "It has records from around the time of the Wizengamot and the Ministry's formation. The less you know, the better." "True," Hermione couldn't help but wonder. "I wasn't aware that any of you worked jointly on the pet project, or really knew each other outside of wherever it is you all meet to plot." "We don't. We're all linked by a common goal. I just happen to be working with this person." Hermione continued sipping her wine. It wasn't much longer before the smell of baking bread began to suffuse the kitchen. "Anything else?" In another uncharacteristic move, instead of savoring, Percy finished his wine in 2 mouthfuls and refilled. Whatever was still bothering him wouldn't come clear in his mind. Frustrating for someone like him, Hermione could relate. It was a more intricate problem, the answer more elusive, human in both element and in scale. Personal. Hermione couldn't think of the last time either of them had gone to the other about anything along those lines. Maybe around 2 years ago, when Penelope Clearwater eloped with a famous American Quidditch player. But Percy had taken the blow with ease, using her home as an escape from everyone's prying eyes and his mother's nagging about when he was going to settle down. Tonight was obviously different. "Just one thing." Percy had all the hallmarks of a man who had something weighing heavily on his shoulders. He exhaled the last bit of what held him back and addressed his issue head-on, like the Gryffindor he was. "Pansy." Which prompted Hermione to finish her glass as well. She needed a fresh one to tackle that particular issue. They both did. "What about her?" Hermione carefully asked as she poured, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. He ran a frustrated hand down his styled hair, messing it up. Then he scowled at himself before fixing it. It wasn't the same. Percy was off balance, unsteady, both shaken and still composed in a way only he could be. And of course she knew the reason. The who that had slipped their way under his skin with a single interaction. Admittedly, it had been a long interaction that had lasted long past dinner. They'd gone from the table to the sofa in the conservatory, then to the swing outside. The exchange hadn't been constant chatter from what she'd remembered, just bits of exchanges. But the looks from Pansy spoke her curiosity louder than apathy. Moments where Percy had been real enough to shed his perfectly crafted skin and laugh at something she'd said. Small smiles had been thrown back and forth between the two, which served as a confirmation of the formation of tenuous strings of connection. Hermione had witnessed most of their exchange from the vantage point where she, Harry, and Ron had drank and talked until they were laughing at nothing and grinning at everything. And even through the haze of wine, even while brushing Ron's hand off her knee every now and then, she could still see that Percy had seemed at ease in a way Hermione wouldn't have believed possible had she not seen it for herself. He was far less removed and more engaged than she could ever remember him being with any other woman he dated. More than that, there had been a certain amount of genuine contentment in the air around Percy that night, one she had never experienced for herself with another person who wasn't his close friend or a pseudo-family member. Hermione was self-aware and realistic enough to recognize that something like that wouldn't happen with her, just as she knew it was unlikely that she even could unknowingly expose herself the same way Percy naturally had that night around Pansy. In fact, Hermione had known he was in deep, far before Harry had taken one good look, laughed, and said just that. "How long have you been friends with her?" Percy was clearly trying not to sound as hungry for knowledge as he was. "A couple of years. We have a peace treaty." "Literally or figuratively?" "Both." Hermione shrugged a little and ran a hand over her hair. Percy looked as confused as he was intrigued. With a fond shake of her head, she smirked a bit. "We've come a long way from arguing around kitchen cabinet colors. We're not as different as I had once thought." She paused. "Well, we are, but I've learned to appreciate that." "She has a story." Then he frowned at himself. "It's probably not your place to say." "Everyone has a story, but it's as easy to get swept up in what we think a person's story might be, when in fact we really have no idea what it is unless they share it with us. But you're right, it's not my place to tell you hers. I don't know it all myself." But since Hermione was a good friend and had a great deal of respect for him, she leveled with him. "However, I can offer you a bit of advice, if that's something you might want." "I doubt I'd be here if I didn't need a bit of guidance." They exchanged looks before Hermione made a small noise in the back of her throat, at the time Percy sipped his wine. This was well outside of her comfort zone, but he had asked, just as she had offered. "Pansies are colorful and delicate." Hermione ran her finger along the rim of her glass. "Common, but beautiful. They live under conditions where most things would die." She looked over to find Percy watching her closely, as if he were committing her words to memory. He truly wanted to understand. It was endearing in a way that softened her a bit. Like her namesake, Pansy may not look like it, but she's been tough and stubborn. She won't quit, has lived through harsh conditions, and doesn't need you for her to continue survival. "That doesn't sound daunting at all." "It's as simple as it's not." Hermione shifted in her chair. "Pansy has to want you. She has to choose you. She has to look at each of her options, each of her reasons for saying no, and decide to say yes, despite it all. And you have to be patient until she does." Percy remained thoughtfully quiet for a moment before he drank more of his wine. "Explains why she ignored all my letters. I even sent her a rose today. Peach, for sincerity." He was awkward, just discussing it, blushing from the neck up, but Hermione smiled when he rested his elbow on the table, then his chin on his fist, human in a way that she hadn't expected to like. She found him relatable. Right then, Percy wasn't all waistcoats and confidence and a member of a quiet revolution. He was just a man who didn't understand a woman's heart, or anything else about her for that matter. "I'm not even certain if she liked it." "Did you get it back?" Hermione asked. "No." Then she loved it. That much she knew for certain. Pansy had no problem rejecting anyone. The fact that she hadn't spoke louder than her silence. She's prickly as hell, so be consistent, but not clingy. Don't back her into a corner. Let her breathe. She's got her own commitment issues. But let her tell you about her history because it makes her who she is, which who you seem to be drawn to. A flash of smile she saw was slightly boyish for someone so serious, and it disappeared before Hermione could call him out on it. Percy cleared his throat, sat up straighter, and could tell he was formulating a plan. I have a lot of work to do. It wasn't a question, just a statement. Percy looked determined in that single-minded way of his. You do, and it won't be easy. Arithmancy might be easier. Percy made a small noise in the back of his throat. Well, it's a good thing I gotta know. Hermione laughed, glanced at the clock. The bread would be done soon. You know, Hermione, he spoke deliberately, which signaled a purposeful shift in their conversation. You're good at giving advice, especially for someone who isn't actively dating. With a shrug, she took a sip of her wine. I happen to have knowledge on this particular subject. Relationships? No. Pansy. Percy chuckled, appearing more at ease, far more relaxed and grounded than he had been when he'd first arrived. Unfortunately, he was secure enough in himself to turn his focus to her. What about relationships? My little brother is circling again. That time, he gave her a knowing look. Hermione drained her second glass, beginning to feel the flush of inebriation. Seems like everyone knows. No one has anything better to talk about? George and Angelina? They're making a real go at it. Which is why everyone is turning their attention to him. And not you? She cocked a brow at him. Percy rolled his eyes. I've been a bit preoccupied trying to restore a government. Apparently, it's still not a good enough excuse for my mother. Hermione barked out a laugh, then covered her mouth to suppress her humor when he scowled. Trust me, my mom is the same. At least yours understands the good you're trying to do. Mine? She winced ruefully. If she had it her way, I'd be married to Ron with 2 children by now. A chuckle was all she received in response. I think that's my mother's wish for you as well. Ron wouldn't oppose either. His tone turned careful, blue eyes exploratory. What about you? What do you want? Not that. Not ever? Hermione considered it. I won't say never, but not with Ron. Percy drank his wine and allowed the silence between them to linger, but not for long. You do know that you didn't answer the question. That you never answer the question about what you want. Only what you don't. I won't argue about it. It's just something for you to consider. She took a deep breath, exhaling her confession. I haven't put much thought into my wants, if I'm being honest. And she was. Coupled with the trust she had in him, the wine began to dull her senses, and her walls dipped lower. I could argue that I have everything I want and need, and nothing else. I'm quite comfortable. I'm content. Yes, I have a Death Eater and werewolf issues, but I'm surviving. Percy gave her a look that made Hermione intensely uncomfortable. Yes, I know, but you're also lying to yourself if you believe you don't want more. He was right, of course. Had he been talking to Harry? You are undoubtedly one of the smartest people I know, but more than that, you're unstoppable. People like you are always in pursuit. You're focused on each challenge you face, and when it's time, you continue pushing towards the next level of excellence. It's not in your nature to be stagnant, but you are. I'm allowed to not push myself harder than I have to. He raised the wineglass to his lips and took several sips. Of course, when it comes to working long hours or extending yourself to your friends, absolutely don't push. However, when it comes to self-fulfillment, determining what you want, what you're looking for, and what will make you happy, or even who, if that's the path you wind up on, you need to invest the time. She knew deep down to the core of her being that Percy was right. No reflection was needed. He just was, and that was just as difficult to accept as it was to correct. The truth was that there was nothing except her own self-awareness to push her forward, which wasn't enough. Percy cleared his throat. Moving further down the road of what you want, my brother clings to this idea that you will come to your senses and realize he's right and that you two belong together. And do you think he is? No. Ron's, well, Ron's still trying to figure out what he wants. And it's different than with you in that he actually does know. He's just not looked anywhere else to find it. And until he does, he'll always come back to what's familiar. You. He'll try to make you fit when you don't. That simply would not work. She and Ron were still the same people, just newer molds of who they once had been. Changed by the experience and circumstances, their contrasts were now more striking. The outside looked just the same, but the inside was different, renovated. Sometimes what had once worked simply didn't anymore. Or maybe it had worked right then, but with all the shifting and molding, the pieces simply stopped fitting. Hermione understood, but Ron, not so much. That doesn't make me a solution. I wasn't the answer the first time, and I won't be this time. I'm not sure what else I can do to make him understand. Percy nodded, swirling the rest of his wine in his glass before taking another sip. I understand that. It was a practical start, but Hermione knew there was more. But you don't know either. What you're looking for, I mean. What you want. I'll know it when I see it. She got up and went to check on the bread, but it wasn't ready yet. She might as well have thrown in a pout for how petulant she both felt and sounded. His chuckle was low and soft, laced with a hum of rational amusement. We're a lot alike, Hermione. And speaking as someone who's still trying to both sort logic from conjecture and make wise decisions about a person I barely know, I could safely say you won't. She looked over her shoulder at the man sitting at her island. First and foremost, you'll need time for your emotions to catch up with your rationale. You never make any moves without first analyzing each step to determine if making a move is even worth it in the first place. True, quite true. Yet Hermione couldn't help but see the flaw in his reasoning. Okay, but you're making a move with Pansy. Surely you haven't completed your calculations after one meeting. Actually, I have. April 11th, 2011. Hermione was an early riser. She relished those quiet hours when the world was dark, hushed and peaceful. Mornings gave her time to think, time to plan, and prepare herself for another day. But that morning was unique. It was her first official day of her new assignment as Narcissa Malfoy's healer, and she gave herself extra time to give the beginning of her new journey the respect it deserved. It wasn't going to be easy. Terminal cases like Narcissa's never were, even without their clash of worlds. But as Hermione scanned through printed articles, she readied herself for a long trip, mentally packing every ounce of patience and stamina she would need along the way as she took her first steps down the road. One that, no matter how long she delayed the inevitable, would ultimately lead to failure, but Hermione tucked that thought away. It wouldn't do if she started the journey already thinking about the outcome. And what did she know? Maybe her detailed records on Narcissa would one day help the researcher who would eventually find the cure for her condition. When she looked at it from that perspective, Hermione couldn't see any of her upcoming work as a failure. Besides, not all failures were necessarily bad. They sometimes empowered a person in a way that success couldn't. And she knew that well because hers had taught Hermione more about her own humility, strength, and perseverance than any of her triumphs ever could. In the quiet hours before dawn, Hermione looked out the window of her office at the sky and privately wondered what lessons she would learn during this one. She was a lifelong student, and as such, she prided herself on always learning new things and challenging her own ideologies. She was bound to learn something from the new experience, even if it was that she would never understand pure-blood culture or Narcissa Malfoy. Well, Hermione thought with a chuckle as she made her way to the kitchen. At least she could work on her list of retorts for Narcissa's brazenly stated opinions. Always best to be prepared. Normally she spent her mornings tending to her conservatory plants before moving outdoors after sunrise, or she would read for pleasure. But that morning, inspired by Narcissa's preferred foods of choice, and the fact that she would be observing her for the entire day for any adverse reactions to the potions, Hermione started gathering everything she might need. She carefully packed enough food to make 3 meals, as she wasn't interested in eating house elf-made meals herself, and all of her utensils and cookware, because she had serious doubts the Malfoys had the proper pans to make, well, anything without magic. Half an hour later, Hermione found herself checking her mental list for the second time. Confident she had everything organized in her bag, she stepped into her flue. Her destination? The Malfoy residence. It was nearly 6 by the time she stepped out of the fireplace. Ceiling lights automatically turned on as the wards admitted her with a magical warmth that tingled down to the tips of her fingers. In truth, she hadn't paid much attention to the wards, or even her surroundings. The last time she had been there, both had been more focused on keeping to her schedule. But now she had time to look past furniture placement. Hermione didn't venture past the invisible boundaries of the open living room and kitchen, but she did venture towards the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, with gray curtains pulled back on each side, that led to their garden. The sky was beginning to stir. Pretty soon, warm colors of pink and orange would trickle across the horizon as the sun began its ascent. It would be beautiful to witness that outside the Malfoys' home, where beyond the white outdoor furniture just past the window, there was a blank canvas of grass. She noted the telescope towards the back with a small nod of interest. A decoration, perhaps. From there, Hermione moved on, beaded bag in hand, slowly circumventing the pristine living room. She took note of the marble staircase by the wall and the long hall that extended past the kitchen, magic turning on each light one by one down the hall, inviting her to explore. She did not accept. Instead, Hermione folded her arms across her chest, frowning at her surroundings. Truth be told, she wasn't surveying their home out of curiosity or to be nosy. Well, not completely. She always looked around her patients' homes as it told her a lot about them, things she couldn't discern through any other means. It was the fastest way to learn about the little odds and ends that made them who they were, which ultimately could be used to determine their motivation, nature, and character. It made her job easier in the long run. And while the Malfoys' unexpectedly modern home drew forth a lot of questions that she couldn't even begin to search for answers to, Hermione couldn't get past one little thing that tickled at the back of her skull. The house felt clinical, impersonal, not at all like a home, more like a museum exhibit. There were no accents or decorations, no bookshelves that could speak of the sorts of subjects they were interested in, no tapestries with faces, no portraits, not even ones that would curse her existence. In fact, there were no pictures of any member of their family. Only abstract paintings that could be found anywhere, artistic and expensive, but ultimately lacking personality and warmth. It was frustrating. Hermione frowned at the feeling, then harder at the kitchen's blank countertops. Their home told Hermione nothing about who the Malfoys were as a family, or even as an individual people. She knew nothing more about Narcissa than she had before entering through the fireplace. But that wasn't entirely true. Their home had told her one thing. They were intensely private. But that should have been obvious. Hermione went into the kitchen and placed her bag on the island, staring thoughtfully into the immaculate, nondescript living room with her forefinger and thumb cupping her chin. Their house had also told her another thing. The Malfoys wanted nothing to do with who they had been before the war. While her current surroundings screamed superiority, there was nothing within her line of sight that told of the rich family history they had once been so proud of. One that was still burning 13 years later under a dome of wards and magic. It was only then that Hermione realized that there was also nothing in this house that so much as hinted at the existence of Scorpius. Harry had 3 kids, but even when James was the only one, signs of him had been everywhere. Here there was no drawn artwork on the fridge, no toys left strewn about, no smudges or stains that even magic couldn't wipe clean. But having met Scorpius, however briefly, it sort of made sense. Hermione put the thought to the side. Solving all the Malfoy family's mysteries in one morning was beyond unrealistic. Family was always a tricky aspect of caring for a terminally ill patient, but she had a little time yet before she really needed them on board. Right now, she needed to focus on why she was there, and that was to try and slow Narcissa's decline. She wouldn't be able to do that without potions, which required breakfast. After looking around for appropriate cookware, and finding none for her intended purpose, Hermione was grateful she had brought her own. She put the perishables she'd packed in the refrigerator and set to work. Breakfast was simple: porridge and a fresh fruit salad, with pecans, chia, an assortment of berries, cut apples with freshly squeezed orange juice. She made enough for both, but still had extras. Something hearty for her first dose of potions. Hermione put a kettle on for tea, pulled out Narcissa's morning potions, and had just finished when she heard a throat clear from the open entrance of the kitchen. Hermione lifted her head, her eyes settling on the sight of Malfoy, who seemed confused by her presence in his kitchen. Well, that made two of them, because Hermione found herself just as baffled by the sight of him. First, he was freshly shaved, likely an act of appeasement to his mother, but second, he was wearing glasses, square-framed and black, and since when did he wear glasses? He hadn't been wearing them before. She would have remembered that. "Malfoy?" Hermione greeted the man, who had the Prophet and a crossword puzzle book in one hand and a pen in the other. His outward appearance sent a clear message to back the fuck off. Typical. With his pale skin and styled hair, he might as well have also had a sign over his head that said unapproachable, for anyone stupid enough to not heed his first message. Malfoy wore black like it was invented just for him, as if it defined him. It was a contrast from his mother, who wore color all of the time, but his choice wasn't particularly shocking. Black was a symbol of power, elegance, and perceived superiority. Harry had mentioned that he was very rarely wore the navy robes that showed his position and rank, refused to, even. No one had argued with him. Briefly, Hermione amused herself with the mental image of his closet having rows upon rows of black suits and robes, dress shirts and ties. All black everything. Or maybe he just had 7, one marked for each day of the week, and on the floor there were 7 pairs of black dress shoes organized in a row, a rigid attire for an equally rigid man. That thought stopped in her mind as if someone had pressed pause when Malfoy greeted her with a nod that was every bit as cool as his eyes were piercing. "Granger." Maybe she had hallucinated it, but Hermione swore she saw his eyes cut down, then back to hers. But when she blinked, he was staring at her impassively. "You look normal today." Malfoy's statement instantly placed her on a defensive edge where she felt that surge, that sharp swell of energy that caused her heart to pump blood forcefully to her muscles. Hermione felt shaky, much like she always did before a fight. She had no idea why, though. She found herself unable to stop from reacting to a statement she would have otherwise let wash over her like the tide. "What's that supposed to mean?" Oh, and his comment definitely hadn't made Hermione reconsider her current attire of jeans and a plain black quarter-length shirt. Not only would that be illogical, it would also go against everything about her unapologetic appearance that she held dear. "Your ankle is better, I presume?" Malfoy's response was a deflection, not an actual answer. He placed the paper, book, and pen on the countertop. "My ankle wasn't hurt." Hermione had all but forgotten about her twisted ankle, having healed it after leaving the Malfoys' house. Not that she would ever admit to injuring herself because his presence had startled her. At that, he said nothing, only approached her with a walk that managed to be businesslike and efficient, but casual at the same time. His energy was distinctive and piquant, but difficult to explain or ignore. In a low voice, just as he passed, Malfoy said, "You're not a very good liar, Granger." Then he continued on, while Hermione's hand flexed, hesitating momentarily over what she had now been reaching for. She didn't really know or remember what she had been doing when she found herself a bit flustered by her own jitters. Tracking Malfoy's movements with her eyes, she observed as he opened an upper cabinet. He reached, but stopped midway, turning his head towards her, eyes sharp and probing. "Can I help you?" Hermione had the good sense to avert her gaze, but she kept her ears open as he went through a sequence of actions that seemed routine, and she resumed hers, pulling her wand out and using it to clear the island of the evidence of her meal preparation, and set the stasis charm needed to keep the food hot. By the time she finished, Hermione heard his footsteps again on the wood, not walking back in her direction, but taking a different path around the island. Lifting her eyes, she watched as he placed a note next to the small bowl and spoon. She was so focused that the sound of the refrigerator opening jarred her. Still, a container of milk floated to the table and landed in front of the bowl, next to the box of Frosties? Hermione's eyebrows raised so high they threatened to merge on the rest of her hair, then higher while she watched Malfoy artfully arrange the bowl and spoon on the table with much more care than needed. Now she officially had more questions than answers. "I can hear you thinking over there, Granger. If you must know, even though it's none of your business," despite the low volume, his tenor carried his irritation across the space between them, "my mother allows my son cereal on Mondays, when he's a good previous week." With that bizarre statement out in the universe wreaking havoc on her baseline knowledge of Draco Malfoy, the man himself retrieved his wand from his jacket pocket and set his own stasis charm. She should have kept silent, but that wasn't her way. His choice in cereal is surprisingly muggle. Gray eyes cut over to her. The tiny tick of his jaw that hinted at his disapproval was barely noticeable, but she still saw it. How unsurprisingly judgmental of you. Still, I expected better. His chide was short, but only a few words, but it was as brutal as the sharp blades flashing from his eyes. His mouth was whipcord thin, jawline strong, more pronounced and crisp now that he was clean-shaven. Malfoy was suited up, armed, and ready for an argument. And because of his attitude, Hermione prepared herself for battle. Hermione chased the thought about his tone back to when he'd said her name, wondering if it had been experiencing an auditory hallucination. Today, Malfoy sounded every bit like the unapologetic arse Harry constantly complained about. She folded her arms across her chest to distract herself from the fact that his tone and words, expression and presence, all of it, had left her inching even closer to that edge that she'd been trying to step away from. Her actions were an attempt to return to the safety of solid ground. It took a breath, then a second, before she felt her agitation recede enough for her to launch a counter. It's not judgmental if it is based on fact. Is that what you tell yourself? Malfoy pocketed his wand, took a step back from the table, then approached. Hermione half expected him to leave, having clearly disturbed his morning, but he took a seat at the other side of the island where she stood. He summoned his paper, book, and pen, and snapped his fingers once, then realized something that Hermione was still trying to process. The house elf was on holiday. Draco sighed. For some unknown reason, she spoke. I've got a kettle on for tea, if you'd like. Malfoy adjusted the rim of his glasses. No, thank you. His response was curt, as expected, before he opened the book to a half-finished crossword he had obviously been working on before. Hermione's presence was forgotten as soon as he picked up his pen and started working on it. Intrigue kept her standing there. Hermione liked crosswords. It was a mental exercise the academic in her greatly appreciated. Not to mention, they were orderly and neat. The one was only one choice for each square. Everything was predestined in a way that was deeply satisfying. Only one thing was off. He used a pen, and that was horrifying. It was gutsy, bold, arrogant. But more than that, he seemed to move efficiently from one clue to the next while she looked on, waiting for him to make a mistake. He didn't. Several minutes passed like that. Hermione stopped anticipating an error and started noticing little things, like the fact that Malfoy was left-handed, and his handwriting wasn't as pristine as his attire, but rather messy and difficult to read. The completionist in her forced her to read the unmarked clues upside down. 4 down is abstruse. His pen abruptly paused on 12 across, mid-letter, and his grip tightened. I know. And there it was, the drawl she remembered, the one she hated. Hermione refused to apologize. A few more seconds passed before Malfoy exhaled in exasperation, recapped his pen, and closed his book. I'm certain you have something better to do. Of course Hermione did, but now that he was here, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to speak to him in private about his mother's care. Perhaps she tried to battle the flames of the fire she had voluntarily walked into. Whatever she was about to say died when Malfoy abruptly unfolded the paper, an act that removed him from her sight. Now all Hermione could see was the front-page photo of the minister and the chief of the Wizengamot posing together under the headline, Ministry Celebrates 7th Economic Surplus, which was unsettling. Most of the ministry's money went to the departments that helped with rebuilding and ensuring their economic future. Far less went to defending that future. It made no sense, but very few of their actions did anyway. Nothing was ever done unless it was to forward their own personal agendas and line their pockets. They were reporting an economic surplus, but couldn't provide lycanthropes wolfsbane, couldn't help those that were destitute after the war and various Death Eaters attacks over the years, and couldn't provide Harry a decent budget to properly train the new Aurors, or re-educate the older ones that swore they knew it all, or even properly staff the task force. A task force, Harry had informed her, that was worse off than the Auror department. It was full of hit wizards that had been selected for a department that made them work long, thankless, and often dangerous hours for very little money. Harry had told her that Malfoy worked for no salary. She looked around. It wasn't like he needed the money anyway, but Hermione frowned once more as the magical picture on the front page, watching the loop of a stiff handshake and even stiffer smiles before looking away, her eyes drifting back to the table he set up for his son. Like his lack of salary, him setting out his son's breakfast was sweet in an odd sort of way that didn't match up with the prattish, arrogant man currently skimming through the morning paper to blot out her presence. The kettle whistle was loud in the silence. Hermione took her time retrieving 2 teacups, but left one on the counter next to the stove for Narcissa when she came down for breakfast. The second one she used to make herself a cup of green tea, not bothering to add anything. She cut off the eye on the stovetop, vowing to bring her electric kettle tomorrow as she leaned back on the counter. Hermione held her teacup in one hand while working the tea bag up and down with the other, keeping her eyes trained on him as she tried to figure out a different way to speak about his mother. From behind the paper, Malfoy's deep, dry voice cut through the quiet like a hot knife through butter. Will your interruption of my daily hour of peace and quiet become a regular occurrence, or is today a special occasion? Hermione stopped mid-step. Now that the real Draco Malfoy was here, and not whoever had been wearing his skin and speaking in his voice yesterday, she made the proper adjustments. This person, Hermione could handle, and did so by narrowing her eyes into a glare that was hot enough for the paper in his hands to spontaneously catch fire. Unfortunately, we'll be disrupting each other's peace for the foreseeable future. I'll be working with your mother as her healer. She has informed me. He brought each end of the paper together to flip the page. After rustling it twice, he went back to reading, still obscured completely by the newspaper. I'll confess I'm surprised that you accepted her after rejecting her so decidedly. It was a dead topic she thought she was finished discussing. Apparently not. I'm well within my right to change my mind after a bit of research. Malfoy folded the paper in half, his eyes already resting on her. Then he doubled it over again, trailing the crease with his thumb and forefinger, his movements precise and crisp. Only after Pansy's meddling, I heard. There was a flutter of interest about how and when he'd heard, but her growing list of questions regarding him was so long the thought of adding more threatened to overload her. Besides, Malfoy clearly hadn't finished. How long have you been a healer? Last I heard, you were marching up the ranks in the ministry. 6 years. Your information must be severely outdated. His noncommittal response hung in the silence until he continued. I find it interesting that you've made a career out of taking on charity projects, albeit unsurprising. Her recoil was minute and instinctive, but judging from the tiny quirk of his brow made the frame of his glasses, he'd still observed her reaction before she was able to cover it up. That only caused an uptick in her irritation. My patients are people, not projects. I doubt you'd like it if I considered your mother as a project. Project or person. It means very little to me how you think of my mother. Only that you actually do the job she's paying an exorbitant fee for you to do. That job you speak so flippantly about is working to monitor and possibly slowing the progression of her dementia. Hermione watched Malfoy's face for any clues he might subconsciously provide, but he gave nothing away, locked up tight. Daphne was right. I figured that would be important to her son, of all people. He opened his mouth to speak, but Hermione cut him off before he got started. Furthermore, I didn't set my salary. Your mother did. I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything, Granger. I'm merely stating a fact. He adjusted his glasses. My mother is notorious for extravagant spending. Money is no object. Shrugging, he shifted his attention from her for a moment. I don't care about the terms of your contract. I'm more curious about why you accepted her, after rejecting her so swiftly. Malfoy placed the paper on the granite. His voice was laced with suspicion. Why did you change your mind? Hermione pulled herself up from her relaxed position against the counter, approaching the island he was sitting at. She noticed as his focus narrowed on her. I have my reasons. That's not an answer. Why do they matter to you? His brow raised over the rim of his glasses. I make it my business to know these things, especially if it involves a member of my family. Your mother isn't easy. What ulterior motives would I have to accept her as a patient? Folding his arms across his chest, he stared straight at her. You tell me. It wasn't his words, but rather the implication beneath them that rubbed her the wrong way. Do I look like the sort of person that would exploit her? Better yet, is your mother the sort to be exploited? Not at this stage, at least. It was a thin reply at best. Narcissa was under the impression that he didn't care whether she lived 1 second more than she should, but his attitude made Hermione have second thoughts. As for your other questions, I suppose it's a matter of character, and I don't believe I know yours. Touché. My character, on the other hand, has little to do with how you treat my mother. Malfoy sounded as frustrated as she felt. Good. She observed the stiffness of his shoulders and the small tick of his jaw, cataloguing them for later. No, but your character has everything to do with how well you and I are going to work together in the future as your mother declines. Then it shouldn't matter because you and I will not be working together. Resting her teacup on the island, she folded her arms across her chest, mirroring him. That's interesting. In more than one way, because Malfoy was absolutely delusional if he didn't think he would have to be involved himself at some point. At any point, really. Regardless of what you think, how you feel, or your relationship with your mother, there will come a point when you will have to step in. You'll need to plan for her as her magic becomes erratic, and she begins to forget everything, including you. She will have hallucinations and motor control issues. She'll become combative and have mood swings. She may apparate in a moment of confusion and splinch herself. There's so much more to contend with, and you can't ignore simply because of how you feel. Yes, she might have healers, but you will have to start making decisions for her when she cannot. I am perfectly aware of my duties, Granger. Malfoy's voice was dangerously soft, with an undercurrent of pure steel. I am constantly reminded of them. Because she was listening so closely for clues, she spotted it. Beneath the cold ice of his irritation laid something that made her pause, made her reconsider her words and even her tone. She could hear his bone-deep exhaustion. Hermione sipped her green tea to wet her suddenly dry throat. It didn't help. She cleared her throat. I said no to your mother initially because we know each other, and that's strictly against my rules. That's it. No other factors played into my initial decision. Why I changed my mind, well, it wasn't just Pansy advocating for your mother, but Harry as well. And she noted the small spark of interest, holding on to it for a rainy day. Why would Potter... Harry said he would have accepted her. In response, Malfoy only blinked. Then he looked away, frowning deeply. It should have been Roger Davies here in my place, but ultimately the decision was mine. And I made the choice with the firm belief that I am the best healer for the sort of care that your mother needs. The silence that remained was not a calm or relaxing one, though Hermione felt some measure of relief for the break in conversation. Charming words, Granger. From his tone, that meant very little to him, which was fine because they were true. And your history with my family won't affect her care? Not only did I take an oath when I became a healer, but I wouldn't have taken her case if in my core I could believe I couldn't be biased. I understand the threat against your family. We all face the same opposition. But are you really so paranoid? When he didn't respond, she took a quiet breath to mask her irritation. Your mother will receive the best care I can provide, considering the parameters she's set. His face continued to give nothing, so she tried yet another approach. Do you have any questions about her treatment plan? I can provide a copy of... That won't be necessary. As I've stated, I don't care to be involved with my mother's care. It sounded less and less like his lack of involvement was due to his trust of her treatment plan, and more because he simply didn't give a damn. When lined up with how he'd repeatedly asked why she had accepted Narcissa as a patient, his apathy didn't match up. Not many things about him were lining up with what she knew of his character. Hermione wasn't sure how she felt about that. Rather than hold on, she released the thought with the knowledge that it wouldn't go far. Fundamental things that didn't make sense never ventured too far from her. With it gone for now, Hermione touched on a topic that she would one day need to attack more vigorously in the future. Today, however, she approached it like a spooked deer. "Your mother needs your support." Malfoy did not look impressed. "My support?" "She's not going to survive this." She barely refrained from speaking the words. Which was fine, as Malfoy wasn't done giving his short-sighted opinion on the topic. "If you think we're going to sit around and discuss our feelings on her mortality, then you obviously don't know my family." "No, I don't," Hermione said honestly. "However, I find it a bit strange that you care more about your mother bringing her security detail everywhere because of the threat of Death Eaters than you care about her disease that's actually killing her." His face settled into a mask harder than the granite one that separated them. "Don't presume that after one day you know the inner workings of my family." "I never assume anything. I was merely making an observation." "Your observation sounds a lot like judgment, which you have absolutely no—" "Observation, Malfoy, is a neutral act of taking in information. Judgment involves formulating an opinion regarding both the value and merit of what's being observed. If you're going to use the two words, know what they mean, and they aren't interchangeable." The hard look he gave from behind his glasses made Hermione straighten her spine and meet his stare just as boldly. "Bullshit, Granger." "No, it isn't. Malfoy scoffed. "You don't know how to separate observation from assumption and judgment. You observe something and immediately formulate an interpretation. And from that interpretation, you make a decision. An assumption, really." "That's not true." "Case in point, my son's cereal choices." Malfoy held her gaze, a challenge in his stare. "You observe his cereal choice and assume that because we're purebloods, we don't know anything about the Muggle world, much less allow him to have anything from it, which validates my previous statement." Hermione attempted to make a counterpoint, but hesitated because, well, he might have had a point. The look on his face transformed. He recognized his victory, but she wasn't finished. "Fine. Then help me understand. I'll be treating your mother for the foreseeable future, and whether or not you know it, treating her is more than giving her potions to ease the symptoms of her disease. It's about understanding her drive to seek care in the first place, and making sure I can keep her motivated to stay the course, even when things become more difficult down the line. Family has always been a motivator to her. It's why she sought my help in the first place, and it will make my job easier when I know that I'm working with." At her request, Malfoy eyed her sharply, his head slightly tilting to the side as he observed her with what looked like bewilderment. Hermione had no idea. She had no real baseline that she could use to decipher him, except Hogwarts, and that was as skewed a reference point as any because he wasn't that child anymore. His response said as such. "My mother is your only patient. You would do well to remember that." But before he left, he pointed at the bowl of porridge under the stasis charm. "However, in the interest of helping," the last word came out in a sneer that took her back to second year, "I'd like to wish you luck, Granger. You'll need it to get my mother to willingly eat that bowl of slop." As she watched him go, Hermione briefly considered testing her luck to see if she could make a direct hit when she threw it at his head. Unfortunately, Malfoy had been right. Narcissa stared at the bowl of porridge like it had personally offended her, or like it would spontaneously come to life, or like she was trying to identify it without having to outright ask. Hermione wasn't completely certain which, as her face seemed to go through a wide range of emotions before settling back on a look of extreme suspicion. She heaved a patient sigh, then glanced at her watch. Almost half an hour had passed since she'd floated into the kitchen elegantly, dressed in a long, flowing periwinkle robes, and a simple necklace with a plain gold band. She must have already dressed for hosting tea with acquaintances at noon, before her afternoon potions, an hour when Hermione would make herself scarce. Narcissa's symptoms weren't obvious that morning, but they were present. There was a light sheen of sweat on her forehead that she tried to dab away, despite the hand tremors. She voiced her deep frustration at having forgotten where she'd placed her favorite brooch, forgot an answer to one of Hermione's questions, and was agitated from a poor night's rest. Hermione hoped the complete regime of potions would help, but it would be days, or even a week, before she would be able to definitively determine that. Still, Hermione placed several charms on one of her bracelets to turn it into a tracker that would continually monitor her vitals. The results would appear in real time on charmed paper that Hermione would check regularly. She also quietly set a deterrent charm, just in case Narcissa decided one day that she wanted to remove it altogether. That could not happen. Hermione's second cup of tea was nearly empty, her food long since finished, bowl and spoon washed by hand and put away, and she found herself pretending not to watch Narcissa Malfoy. Hermione skimmed the calorie content from the box of cereal that was still where Malfoy had left it, along with the milk, bowl, and spoon, all neatly arranged across from where she sat. The sugar content was obscene. Narcissa delicately poked the porridge with her spoon, and Hermione cut her eyes over to her, clearing her throat politely, which made the older witch glance at her. "It's quite good, if you give yourself a chance." Hermione felt like she was speaking to a petulant child. The suspicious look only deepened. "I do not eat breakfast in general, which is why I made porridge. It's a start. You'll have to eat, as the morning potions will make you nauseous if you don't." Besides, Hermione had watched as Narcissa tried to cover the tremor that had passed not too long ago by attempting to start a conversation about changing the drapes by the window. The last of her old potions was out of her system, and, while it was informative to see her baseline, Hermione wasn't interested in watching her struggle to hold a spoon any longer than necessary. "Perhaps if I drink tea—" "It's not enough." Hermione folded her hands in a show of thinning patience. "Perhaps if we determine what you would eat for breakfast, maybe— There's a very long list of things I would rather eat than this." She poked the porridge again with her spoon. "You haven't actually tried it." Frowning, Hermione wondered if she should have tried a more traditional English breakfast for the first day. "It looks most unappetizing." The witch nudged a blueberry in her fruit bowl with her spoon. "The fruit salad at least looks palatable, but I have no taste for it at the moment. Not when it is room temperature. I have it on good account that you like pie, which is essentially warm fruit." Hermione frowned and rolled her eyes. "Perhaps I could make you a smoothie." If possible, the look on her face soured even more. "That sounds even more unappealing." "How could you possibly know?" "I know because I have extremely delicate sensibilities, Miss Granger." She was about to retort when she heard footsteps approaching quickly on the wood floors, much too quickly to be Malfoy's, or any adult's, which meant— Hermione turned just in time to catch sight of the youngest Malfoy approach. "Remember your manners, Scorpius." Narcissa didn't even look up from the porridge that she had finally scooped under her spoon. Her words made him halt in the entryway, but his eyes scanned the room, obviously not finding what he had all but ran into the room in search of. His shoulders fell in disappointment, until he spotted Hermione, who was unabashedly staring at the little boy, struck by just how much he looked like his father. Well, except for the small differences. In school, Draco had always been just a bit taller than Harry, but Scorpius was slightly shorter than Albus, who was taller than James had been at his age. How he compared to other children his age, Hermione had no idea. Still, he was a slight boy with pale skin. Hair that was more blonde than white was parted to the left and combed back neatly. He had been dressed like a schoolboy in black shorts, white shirt, a dark blazer, socks rolled up, and leather shoes. It was likely his everyday attire, judging by the way he didn't pick and pull at it. Or perhaps it wasn't in his nature to do such a childish thing. "You may approach," Narcissa said formally, which struck Hermione as bizarre because she was speaking to her grandchild, not a stranger. She'd heard so many stories about how much she doted on Malfoy, and had seen the evidence of it with all the sweets he'd received during school, so it struck Hermione as odd to see Narcissa being so stern with Scorpius. It was to the point where she considered laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of the entire situation, but unable to do so because it wasn't a joke. It was real life. And it called into focus Daphne's words from a few days ago, especially when Scorpius did as instructed, obediently advancing with careful steps. His chin was slightly raised, back straight, and shoulders held in a posture so perfect it looked robotic on a child. Trained was the first word that came to mind. Hermione turned back to her still steaming tea, taking a long sip to rid herself of the slightly peculiar feeling associated with the word. Scorpius stopped next to Narcissa's chair. waiting to be addressed. Hermione placed her teacup on the saucer with a small clink. "How did you sleep?" the older witch asked her grandson. She waited to hear a childlike response, if only to determine if he sounded like Malfoy at all. But it wasn't until the silence following her question stretched on that Hermione remembered something of utmost importance. He didn't speak. At that, she turned her head, only to lock eyes with the bluest eyes she'd ever seen on a person. Piercing and bright, they weren't his father's eyes, but she caught the stubbornness and shrewd intelligence in them that he'd inherited from the man himself, as well as that childlike curiosity she remembered from Theo's office. When she smiled politely in greeting, his ears turned red and he briefly looked down. Hermione's grin transformed instantly for one reason only. Scorpius was adorable. Not nearly as hard and pointy as his father, the boy was softer, not as cold. In fact, the more she looked at him, the more she could tell that there was something warm about him, despite his grandmother's treatment. Narcissa noticed Scorpius staring at her and chided him. "You mustn't stare, Scorpius. It is impolite." The little boy looked down once again in a bashful apology. Then he must have remembered himself because he stood straight, like he had been taught to do, averting his eyes. But it only lasted a moment because Hermione turned in her chair towards him, leaning in it a bit as she offered her a hand to shake. "I'm Hermione." Scorpius looked at her hand for several moments, but like with Theo, he made no move to accept it, simply lifting his eyes back to hers. And though it was a rejection, it didn't feel like one, because Scorpius kept staring at her in the way small kids often did, curious, because he wanted to learn, because she was something new to his world. A quick glance at his grandmother made him remember his manners, which was why he bowed politely before stepping back. Hermione's eyes followed him all the way to the chair across the table from hers, her smile waning, transforming into something more thoughtful as she watched him take his seat after removing his blazer and patting his pockets. The chair was charmed to automatically bring him up to the appropriate height for him to sit comfortably. A bit of magic Hermione hadn't seen before, but Scorpius never reacted. Apparently this was his normal, his routine. It was odd to watch a child methodically settle in for breakfast. Scorpius knew where everything should be. He didn't even look when he first reached for the scrap of paper she had seen Malfoy leave. A note, Hermione's brain corrected. Draco Malfoy left a note for his son. Not out of the ordinary for any father, but the way Daphne spoke of his distance didn't exactly make a lot of sense when she put next to the note. But Hermione pondered it further as she watched him unfold the note, blue eyes scanning the words with deep concentration, as if he... Scorpius can read a little, but I doubt he can read Draco's handwriting. It's incredibly poor. Almost on cue, his head turned to the side, still trying to figure it out. Hermione suppressed her laughter, disguised it as a cough that didn't fool anyone. Narcissa frowned, and when she glanced back at Scorpius, she found his unamused expression reminiscent of his father. "He is quite shy, Miss Granger." Narcissa gave the little boy who had gone back to his note a look before pouring milk into a cereal bowl. Briefly, she left the table and returned with a small glass of juice, placing it to his right. Scorpius looked instantly confused by the drink, but of course remained silent. "Do not be offended if he does not speak to you. I make sure to speak to him normally, even though I know I will not receive a response." Well, Daphne had told her, but still, it was so bizarre all Hermione could manage was, "Oh." "Make no mistake, he can speak, Miss Granger. He just stubbornly chooses not to." Scorpius looked directly at Hermione, as if confirming his grandmother's statement with a blank expression. Then he picked up his spoon with his left hand, yet another thing he inherited from his father, and tucked into his sugary cereal with manners highly unusual for a boy his age, or any age at that matter. Narcissa delicately tasted her porridge. She didn't use her napkin to spit it out, though. From the look on her face, it was a close call. Upon her first couple of chews, her face morphed from skeptical to cautiously impressed. "It is not as horrific as it looks." "Good." Meanwhile, Hermione's mind was short-circuiting from the large quantities of rapid-fire processing it performed in the seconds after her statement. Not about her finding the porridge palatable, but before, about the silent little boy politely eating his cereal while staring at the note next to his bowl. He looked like a miniature Draco Malfoy reading the paper. Just without glasses, the cold disposition, or the attitude. "Scorpius, Narcissa gently chastised after a large silence where Hermione finished her tea and stored away her observations, carefully not to make assumptions. "Do not slouch." She ate her porridge slower than the little boy started, watching her, emulating her. Hermione cleared her throat. "You should finish soon. I'm trying to keep your potions on a schedule, and you're running a little close to the end of it." Which was enough to distract Narcissa from further conversation. Spoon halfway to his mouth, Scorpius regarded her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read before he went back to his breakfast. The meal progressed quickly from there, with pockets of conversation with Narcissa and her continued observation of the silent Scorpius. But once Narcissa finished, Hermione watched as she proceeded to take her first set of potions, chasing each with tea. They were quite disgusting. After running a series of diagnostic charms that had the youngest Malfoy observing in wide-eyed wonder, Hermione went about clearing the table after checking the results on the charmed parchment. "Do not trouble yourself, Miss Granger. The nanny will be in shortly to sort it. She usually fills in on the weekends when Zippy is on holiday." "It's no trouble at all." Hermione went back to work, picking up her empty teacup and Narcissa's bowl and walking them over to the sink. With her back turned, Hermione listened for any mishaps while she did the washing. Scorpius appeared at her side, politely handing Hermione his empty bowl, his cup, and his spoon inside of it. He was helping. Graciously, Hermione smiled. "Thank you, Scorpius." The little boy slowly nodded in a move that was so like his father that it was almost comical, and yet very strange. "Scorpius!" When his grandmother called him, Hermione watched as he returned to her side. She made quick work of cleaning his bowl and drying everything with a wave of her wand, levitating each piece back into its place while pretending not to listen, when in fact she was listening for every scrap of information that could help her understand just what the hell she'd walked into. "You did very well yesterday. Let us make it another day with no incidents." There was a chill in her tone that settled on Hermione's spine. A pause followed her words, and Scorpius responded with that strange bow of his. "You have 2 minutes, and your tutor is waiting for you upstairs in the library." Hermione turned around just in time for his stiff exit, making certain Scorpius was long gone before she moved from her spot at the sink. "How old is he?" Of course, she already knew, but she asked more to make conversation than anything else. She wanted to hear what Narcissa had to say about him when he wasn't around. 5. "He is extremely well behaved." That was a massive understatement. He seemed more like a miniature adult than a child, except for moments when she saw hints of the child. "We pay excellent money for tutors to make sure of it." The detached quality of her voice made Hermione suddenly anxious for a change of subject. "The schedule you've provided states that you are hosting tea. Is there a place where I can make myself scarce during that time with some reading I need to do?" "As you plan to monitor me throughout the day for the next 30 days, you can use Draco's office to work. It is just down the hall." She pointed in the direction her grandson had just disappeared, which led her to believe that there was more than one staircase in their home. The second she knew of just being off the living room. "It should be to your liking." Hermione nodded absently, noticing the small changes in her physical symptoms since she'd taken her morning potions. Her eyes even looked brighter. "How do you feel? The combination is designed to give you a little energy boost." "Then they are working as planned. I actually feel—" Narcissa tilted her head to the side almost as if she couldn't believe her next words. "Quite good." It was either a success or a placebo effect. Only time would tell. If Hermione had to predict how Malfoy's office would look, she would have guessed that it resembled the rest of the home. Modern and clean, with neutral tones, elaborately furnished, and 0 personal touches. Enigmatic. Truthfully, she would have only earned half marks. Malfoy's office reminded her of her own. It was about the same size, cozy and not too large, with a darker wood desk that had a healthy amount of clutter. There were no plants, but there was a large, faded Turkish rug that looked more like a tapestry. Terribly unsightly, really. In front of the fireplace was a black leather sofa and a glass table. Above the fireplace hung an ornate family portrait, with Narcissa, Draco, and Scorpius, all looking very stern and all dressed in black. The faces of the Malfoy family. If Hermione had to guess, it had been done recently, as the frame was brand new. There were 2 smaller portraits next to the larger one of Draco standing alone, currently looking severe, frowning at her presence in his office. The next one was of Narcissa and Scorpius, taken likely the same day as the larger portrait. Portrait Narcissa had her hands on his shoulders, and the boy looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. It was saddening. Hermione looked away, looked on, taking in the entire wall lined with floor-to-ceiling bookcases, all organized and packed to the brim. But that wasn't all that got her attention. From the doorway, at a mere glance, his office looked very much like it belonged to the conservative man society thought he should be. Books that spoke to his intelligence, family portraits that spoke to his dedication to his duty to uphold his family name, and a space that was just ornate enough to remind a visitor of his extreme wealth. But when she stepped through the threshold and took a deeper, closer look, she spotted the inconsistencies that were only noticeable to the most observant of people. The books themselves were a dichotomy between what society knew of Draco Malfoy, how he presented himself to the world, and the identity of the man, judging from the clutter, spent a lot of time in this room. They weren't all on magical subjects by magical authors. No dark arts text or any manuscripts of any extremists. Instead, they were books on chemistry and geology, botany and physics, philosophy and art history, Buddhism. She spotted Blanchard, Derrida, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, classical fiction, and a few autobiographies, poetry. And that was just what she could see. There was so much more to explore if she climbed the black ladder and scanned the higher shelves, but Hermione didn't. She left it alone with one question to the empty office. Who is Draco Malfoy? Nothing made sense. Not the home, and certainly not the people living within its walls. None of it fit in the neat box she'd created for them, based off their bits and pieces she'd picked up from what others had said, the larger pieces of what she already knew, and the more telling bits from their recent conversations with Narcissa. And for someone like Hermione, who liked things that made sense because they brought order to chaos, it really wreaked havoc on her world view. It would have been easy to brand them as a pureblood cliché, reduce them all to the vision of what they ought to be, and how the hell she could possibly do that now. Now, when Malfoy's earlier words were still ringing in her head so loud she had to jerk her head from side to side for it to subside. Now, when she had to take a hard look at her own flawed logic and question it, and herself. Hermione opened her mind to every angle, and reminded herself that there wasn't a metric to measure people. It was something she already knew down to the deepest part of her, and yet, for some reason, that rule hadn't been applied to the difficult Malfoys. Maybe, most definitely, it was her bias. That stubborn, know-it-all part of her that just knew she had them all figured out, and she was right about the sort of people they were. The part of her that... Hermione sighed in resignation. The part of her that judged. There, she said it. Hermione could admit that she'd made a few assessments about them that hadn't been correct. A character flaw of sorts. Would it change now that she was standing in the most confusing room of the house? No. But what she could do was something she should have done the moment she accepted Narcissa as a patient. Start over. No, truly start at the beginning with them, as she had done with every other patient. She needed to scrub her mind of everything she knew of the Malfoys, and start with a clean slate. Hermione could admit to herself that she was well outside of her depths when it came to them. She had no idea who they were, and she knew they needed to go about learning them in a better way, more productive way. Only then would she learn without bias, and help Narcissa throughout the course of her illness, without harming or drawing any inference from one belief about them to another. No matter what Malfoy thought, she really was treating the entire family. Giving them time. No matter how much he didn't want to be involved or said he didn't care, Malfoy would have to accept that his mother was dying, and there was nothing to be done about it. It was inevitable. But as her healer, Hermione had tasked herself with caring for Narcissa and walking alongside with all of them to help them through each phase, until the end. She couldn't take that journey with them if she didn't know them. Malfoy especially, Narcissa's only child, the one who would take her loss the hardest. So, Hermione packed away all the assumptions, excavated her unconscious attitude, stepped back from all that she had known, and was left with nothing. Of course, she didn't completely delete it all. Everything always had a way of making itself relevant again. But she wouldn't lean on those experiences, presumptions, and expectations to make decisions about her observations before she'd really given it some thought. Feeling more optimistic, Hermione crossed the room to Malfoy's desk, with her bag in hand, ready to dig into research for light reading. But when she sat at his cluttered desk, she saw, well, Draco Malfoy. Not just an aggravating man, her old classmate and adversary, and Narcissa's only son, but Hermione saw him as a father. There, in a neat, simple frame, turned away from the room, for his eyes only, was a moving picture of him holding his newborn Scorpius, with a look of confused wonder on his face that slowly transformed into a smile. The photo was so intimate and warm, so unlike who she knew him to be, that Hermione turned her head only to catch another photo. It had been taken recently. Both father and son, dressed in black, bespoke suits, not smiling or touching or anything. Cold. Hermione found it strange that such vastly different photos were displayed side by side on his desk, hidden from view, as if... Not allowing herself to take one more step in the direction of that thought, she abruptly stood and claimed a spot on his sofa. After rifling around in her bag for her research, Hermione immersed herself in her task. She needed to clear all of the excess from her mind and focus on a task that called for her full attention. Eventually, though, Hermione needed to spread her work out on the glass coffee table, so she did, making notes on the printed paper and pen and highlighting important bits that warranted further research. In fact, she was so wrapped up in examining everything, flipping through article after article, comparing them to the books she'd bought along, that all of it nearly went airborne when the flue flared to life and Draco Malfoy walked out of it as if he were stepping out of hell and back onto Earth. Malfoy, no longer in glasses, was so surprised by her presence that it stopped him in his tracks, completely speechless. His mouth opened, then closed again, just long enough for him to get his bearings. Then his eyes darkened like the sky before a storm, and his hand flexed at his side. "What are you doing in my office, Granger?" Hermione almost apologized, but she stopped herself. Apologize for what? Unconsciously, she sat up straighter, pushing her hair from her shoulder. Hermione met his cool glare with one of equal measure. "Your mother said I could work in here while she hosted tea. She said you would be late, as always." "Did she now?" Malfoy intoned with a deep frown. His response was more of a statement than a question. "I happen to have left a roll of parchment here. For work." That unique feeling of discomfort returned, creeping along her spine as she started gathering her papers together in a rushed pile, mixing things she'd wanted to keep separate. It didn't matter. A fleeting thought was given to the photos on his desk, and really, Hermione felt secretly guilty for invading what obviously was his private space. "I can leave. I didn't mean to intrude." "That won't be necessary." His words halted her move to depart. Hermione raised her attention to the wizard, noting the fact that Malfoy was still standing there, still watching her with scrutiny like she'd done something wrong, when she had only followed instructions. "I'll have a conversation with my mother later." "She didn't seem to think you'd mind." But her argument in Narcissa's favor did nothing to appease him. "That's the problem right there, Granger." His voice was incredibly tight. "She didn't think." Finally, he moved from his spot in front of the fireplace, crossing the room to his desk. Her eyes tracked his movement, watching, waiting in silent tension, as he picked up a roll of parchment off his desk. Without turning around, he asked in a tone so deadly serious that she continued gathering her papers because, fuck this. "Did you sit at my desk?" Exactly how he knew, Hermione had no idea. She'd been careful not to touch anything. For a breath, she considered lying, but decided it was pointless to lie to someone who already knew the answer before asking the question. "I did, but only for a second. Your desk didn't provide the space I needed, so I moved to the sofa." Malfoy turned his head to her, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Contempt?" "Did my office provide you with everything you needed to make your judgment of me?" Setting her jaw, Hermione stood up with her papers in hand, fighting back the urge to respond in a way that would only escalate things, because she wanted to, but she knew it wouldn't do anyone any good. Not after the decision she'd just made. Hermione stepped out from her spot in front of the sofa, having nothing to hide. "My observation, Malfoy, is simple. I don't know the person you've become in the last 13 years. That much is true, but the same goes for you." She took a step towards him, probing. "Perhaps I'm not the only one with preconceived notions." His face changed with recognition. "Ah, so you admit it." Something about me that you don't know, Malfoy? I'm not scared to admit when I'm wrong." Hermione shrugged, and when his expression slowly transformed to something akin to tightly focused bewilderment, she took a step forward, then another, watching him. "I've never claimed to be perfect, nor do I expect myself or anyone else to hold themselves to such an impossible challenge." "That doesn't quite fit with your reputation as the brightest witch of our age." "My reputation may be that, but it's just not exactly who I am. It's who others think I am. Just like you aren't exactly your reputation," Hermione had almost said, but she stopped herself, backtracked. "I get angry and can be vindictive. I can be self-righteous and hypocritical. I have little shame in who I am because that person is ever evolving as I challenge myself to be better. Right now, I am challenging myself, not just as it pertains to your mother, but also as it pertains to you." She paused when Malfoy's brows drew together. "However, just as I have made assumptions about your family, you have made assumptions about me. And yet, I feel there's more that you want to add." Malfoy folded his arm, leaning back on his cluttered desk, the mask of ease, even when his clenched fist spoke of agitation. "No addition, only perhaps—" Hermione held up a finger and offered a metaphorical olive branch. "As in, perhaps, in time, I hope that we might have a better, judgment-free understanding of one another." Malfoy's cold glare and snide question was quintessentially him. "And why would we do that, Granger?" "Because we're adults, not quarreling children," she reminded him pointedly. "And because of your mother. I'll be a part of your life, in some respect, for the rest of hers. You might not like it, but it's fine." He stared at her long and hard for several moments before he pushed off his desk. 2 steps later, and he was directly in front of her, speaking in a voice that kept her single-minded focus on him. "Speaking of the future, for future reference, my office is off limits. To everyone." Malfoy left the same way he came in. Hermione stood in her living room after a long first day for a solid 30 minutes, just blinking at nothing before she waved the proverbial white flag and called an emergency gathering. On a Monday. No matter. By the time Hermione arrived at the not-so-crowded pub in Hackney, no less than an hour after she sent off the request via Patronus, Pavarti and Pansy were already there, sitting at a quieter table near the back. The former had the most obnoxious fruity pink drink waiting while the latter had 4 shots sitting in front of her. Hermione eyed them both skeptically before taking the seat between them. "I apparated here. Are you both trying to make me splinch myself going home?" She examined one of the shot glasses full of clear liquid. "Is this Russian vodka? Yes. 2 for you and 2 for me." Pansy grinned. "Have you eaten? I ordered beef Wellington for you. Should be around soon." "I haven't eaten since lunch," which had included meeting Scorpius's young nanny who had delivered him for a meal with his grandmother, but didn't stick around. Narcissa hadn't returned from tea at that time, so Hermione had spent 10 long minutes locked in a staring match with a 5-year-old. He won. She hadn't expected his presence for the meal, but he ate the chicken salad she'd given him without fuss. Well, the lettuce, tomatoes, and cheese. Scorpius carefully picked around the chicken. The fact that the opposite hadn't happened was strange, but it wasn't her place to give it much thought. Hermione left that bit to Narcissa, who kept prodding him to eat the chicken when she arrived for lunch, but he never did. "In fairness to us," Pavarti said from her left, "we didn't know what state you'd be in when you arrived. The last time you called an emergency meeting on a Monday was when you had that one-off with Crumb 4 years ago when he visited." Hermione whipped her head around so fast she vaguely heard Pansy's "What the fuck?" when the ends of her ponytail hit her in the face. "First of all, I didn't shag him." She almost had, but had gotten cold feet. Victor had been good about it, understanding. After all, they had been essentially pen pals for years. It didn't seem like a good idea. "Second, how did you even know that happened?" Pavarti gave her a long, sly look. "I put 2 and 12 together." When Hermione kept glaring and folding her arms, the witch's smile grew. "I'm a journalist. It's what I do. You went to dinner with him, and after that, every time someone mentioned him, you just deflect." She leaned in close. "Was it terrible?" "Pansy, tell her." But when Hermione looked, she found the other witch waiting eagerly for an answer as well. So she rolled her eyes and deflected. "Who else is on the way?" "Weasley will be late. She's delivering the kids to the burrow because Potter's working late and Luna's coming. Daphne is working. Padma and Susan are still at the hospital. Suddenly, Parvati remembered something. Pansy, weren't you supposed to invite Cho? Oops, I forgot. Pansy covered her mouth with a fake gasp. What a shame. Such a pity. Hermione snorted while Parvati whirled her eyes before sweeping her long, wavy curls over her shoulders. So why did you call the emergency dinner? Simple. Today was my first day with Narcissa Malfoy. At that statement, Pansy perked up. Meanwhile, Parvati cringed. You should start off with the Russian vodka. How did it go? Pansy asked. As well as it could. There's the part where Malfoy is... Oh, fuck, you've seen him? Parvati squealed and clapped her hands as she bounded in her seat, garnering attention from the man at the bar who eyed her appreciatively. He's fit as fuck, yeah? Parvati nudged her in the shoulder. I need all the details. Pansy looked as though she were struggling to keep her comments to herself. It took every shred of effort, but she remained quiet. All the details fall under the patient-healer confidentiality agree. Not your job. Him. Was he not as climbable as I said? That's quite literally not the point, Parvati. Pansy nudged one of the shot glasses in her direction, and Hermione drank it in one go, bearing the burn with a tight grimace. She'd never been one for hard liquor. Today it was warranted. Malfoy was a bit intense. An understatement, really. There were natural disasters less intense than him. Parvati sipped on her fruity monstrosity while paying close attention. Hermione rubbed the side of her neck. I don't remember him being like that. A tosser, yes, but he's... You weren't the only one changed by life and circumstances, Granger. I think it's safe to say that Draco has a lot to contend with, in addition to the heavy weight of responsibilities and expectations put on him. And the fact that Pansy had so much respect for the person primarily responsible was baffling. But that topic Hermione would have to approach with better time. We all have different ways that we cope. Draco's is to bear it in silence, completely alone. That's not coping, that's avoiding. That's Draco. There was a sigh to her right that sounded like an infatuated schoolgirl. Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown, or whatever Padma says whenever she's feeling maudlin. Parvati snapped her fingers, cursing herself. Damn, I should have used that one for his feature. Hermione rolled her eyes as Pansy tossed back the second shot. If she felt the burn, she didn't show it. Nice quote, but Draco is no king. No, he was just one man. The greatest wisdom is seeing through appearances. Atissa.